When people are asked to choose where they would consider moving, Canada is almost always at the top of the list. With a reputation of being safe, stable, and prosperous, and having high-quality services, a strong economy, and a well-functioning government, it seems like one of the few countries where you can both make a good amount of money and maintain a good quality of life. Except that, according to many Canadians, that's not true, and actually couldn't be further away from reality. According to 2 polls, 2/3 of Canadians think that everything in the country is broken, and they feel deeply pessimistic about the economic situation and their quality of life. But what's going on? Why do Canadians feel so overwhelmingly unhappy with the state of their country and how bad it all really is? This is the dark side of Canada. Before we analyze what's going on, let's dig a little deeper into how people in Canada are actually feeling. Because while the general stereotype of Canadians is happy and cheerful, the mood in the country at this point could not be any more different. Surveys show that over half of Canadians are angry about the way their country is managed, and 2/3 think that Canada is deeply broken. They're worried about the economy and about being able to even afford their everyday needs. Other data confirms this mix of depression, anger, and pessimism. Most Canadians are dissatisfied with their own country, and they feel that their lives used to be a lot better, and that the services in Canada have gotten significantly worse. Whichever poll or survey you pick, the picture is basically the same and not pretty. Canadians feel more concerned and negative about their economy and their personal quality of life than people in almost any other developed country. The overall sentiment of how people feel about Canada is worse than at any point in recent history. And while Canada still has high rates of immigration, even the immigrants are not really buying the Canadian dream anymore. Studies show that an increasing number of immigrants choose to voluntarily leave Canada due to dissatisfaction with the quality of life and economic opportunities. But what's happening in Canada that could be making people feel this way? Well, even though the country has a reputation for being almost perfect, at a closer look, this image starts to unravel pretty quickly. So here's what's going on. You might have heard by now that much of the world is going through a housing crisis. But wherever you are, it's still probably not as bad as in Canada, which today is one of the least affordable housing markets in the world. In the past 10 years, the value of an average Canadian home has more than doubled, with rent prices growing at a similar rate, making it extremely hard to afford a rental property and almost impossible to actually buy a home. In Toronto, the average resident spends 120% of their income on rent. And if you want to buy a property in Vancouver, you need to be making at least $250,000 to even qualify for a mortgage. In other words, buying a property in Canada is now a possibility only for people with exceptionally high income, and even they struggle to afford the incredibly high mortgage payments. This is why Canada has the highest household debt of all the G7 countries, and why its situation has been described as the largest housing bubble of all time. But why did housing become so insanely unaffordable? Well, there is a strong demand for housing as Canada has a quickly growing population due to the fact that it accepts 500,000 immigrants per year, so it simply needs more homes. But a growing population wouldn't have to be an issue. The real problem is that Canada is completely failing at building enough homes to house all these new people. As in many other countries, the housing policies in Canada are controlled by local city governments, and they have been reluctant to allow the construction of more homes, as that would depreciate the price of properties that are already there. Having fewer homes means that their price keeps going up, which is great for the homeowners who are also potential voters. So local politicians are not addressing this issue to avoid upsetting their current constituents, even though it makes housing unaffordable for everyone else. Add a constantly increasing population, and the fact that Canadian real estate has traditionally been a popular safe investment choice for rich foreigners, especially those from Asia looking for a place to park their cash, and you have a housing nightmare. But it doesn't stop here, because housing is by far not the only thing in Canada that's extremely expensive. Surprisingly, Canadians pay more than almost anyone in the world for a number of common things, like groceries, banking fees, cell phone charges, or air travel. The cost of fuel in Canada is a lot more expensive than in the US, while the cost of healthcare, on the other hand, is a lot more expensive than in Europe. And this is not an accident, but instead a direct consequence of the fact that Canada, more than any other country, is dominated by monopolies and oligopolies. In other words, Most Canadian industries are dominated by just one or a few giant companies. And this didn't happen by accident either, but instead, it's a result of a questionable strategy pursued by many different Canadian governments. At the bottom of this strategy is Canada's long-term fear that its homegrown companies will get steamrolled by their larger and more aggressive competition from the United States. That is a legitimate worry if you live right next to the world's largest and most competitive economy. But it has made Canada a little too overprotective and convinced that the only way to prevent that is by helping Canadian companies get as big as possible. So while governments in most countries try to prevent companies from becoming too big, Canadian governments generally try to help them achieve exactly that. As a result, Canada's economy is made up of just a handful of giant corporations with almost zero competition. But the problem is that monopolies are not good for anyone except for themselves, as many studies have shown. Since they have no competition, they generally tend to hike up the prices just because they can, and the consumers end up paying more for worse quality services, while the companies themselves become less competitive on international markets since they have it so easy at home. Which is why you probably don't know a single Canadian corporation with a global success. And that's kind of another part of the problem. Even though Canada is on paper a very rich country, unlike most of the developed economies, its wealth is mostly based on exporting commodities like oil, gold, and other natural resources, together with the massively inflated real estate sector. But that means that outside of these industries, there's not that many well-paid white-collar jobs, the kind of jobs that college-educated middle-class workers would typically look for. And while Canada technically has a labor shortage, the demand is mostly for the lowest paid and lowest qualified positions. The result of which is that even for the middle class, life in Canada is surprisingly difficult. To top it off, while Canada has a reputation for having high quality and widely accessible public services, especially when compared with the United States, that's not really true either, or at least not anymore. Probably the best example of that is healthcare. Today, only 37% of Canadians think that they would receive proper medical care in case of a sudden medical emergency, compared with 70% of Americans who were asked the same question. And, well, they are right. Canadians are now increasingly more often dying in emergency rooms while waiting to be admitted due to an extreme shortage of medical workers in Canadian hospitals. And that's despite the fact that Canada spends more on healthcare than any European country, while almost all of the European countries outrank Canada in metrics like waiting times and the number of hospital beds. As a whole, the Canadian healthcare system, once a source of pride for the country, is now ranked as one of the worst among the OECD countries. And it's one of the most common reasons why Canadians consider the management of their country to be completely broken. The bottom line is that the idealized image of Canada as a modern-day utopia is, at a closer look, quickly falling apart. The life satisfaction of Canadians has been going down for the past 10 years. And given the escalating housing crisis, unbearable living costs, the monopolized economy, and quickly deteriorating public services, it's not that surprising. Unfortunately, unless Canada starts urgently addressing these issues, the once idyllic perception of the country will become more and more detached from reality.